The year is 1968. In a small town in New York's Hudson Valley, a woman dies alone in a rented room. No family comes, no former colleagues, no friends. Her body is cremated. Her ashes are placed on a shelf at the funeral home, and there they sit, for 20 years, unclaimed. The woman on that shelf had once been the most powerful female reporter in America. She had sat in cabinet briefings. She had traveled 32 states on behalf of the President of the United States. She had lived, for years, inside the White House itself. And she had loved the First Lady. Quietly, completely, at a cost she paid for the rest of her life. Her name was Lorena Hickok. And this is her story. There is a photograph taken in March of 1933, Inauguration Day for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the man who would lead America through the Great Depression and the Second World War. In the photograph, Eleanor Roosevelt stands at her husband's side, composed, elegant, carrying the weight of a public role she had not asked for. On her finger, a ring, sapphire and diamond, given to her not by her husband, but by a woman named Lorena Hickok, a cigar-smoking, sharp-tongued reporter from the Associated Press who had covered the presidential campaign and, somewhere along the way, had become the person Eleanor Roosevelt could not live without. The cameras caught the ring. No one asked about it. That silence, sustained, deliberate, decades long, is the subject of this documentary. Lorena Hickok does not appear in most accounts of the Roosevelt presidency. When she does appear, it is usually as a footnote. Eleanor's close friend, a companion, a confidant. The kind of language that tells you something, while appearing to tell you nothing at all. But Hickok was not a footnote. She was the woman who helped build Eleanor Roosevelt into the figure history remembers. She was the one who encouraged Eleanor to hold press conferences, to write her own column, to speak when the world expected her to stay silent. She shaped the most iconic First Lady of the 20th century, and received in return a life lived in the shadow of everything she had helped create. She gave up a career at its peak. She gave up her independence. She gave up the kind of public recognition she had spent 20 years earning. And at the end of it all, she died in a rented room, and her ashes sat on a shelf for 20 years because there was no one left to claim them. This is not a story about Eleanor Roosevelt, though Eleanor is very much a part of it. This is the story of Lorena Hickok, the woman who stood beside the throne, who held it up from the inside, and who paid for that privilege with everything she had. She was born in East Troy, Wisconsin in 1893, the eldest daughter of a butter maker named Addison Hickok and a dressmaker named Anna Waite. The family moved constantly, Wisconsin to Iowa to South Dakota, following Addison's temper and his inability to hold a job. Every town was a fresh start that became, in time, another reason to leave. Lorena changed schools so often that friendships never had time to form. She was large for her age, self-conscious, awkward in social situations she rarely had the chance to practice. She spent most of her time alone, reading, daydreaming, talking to the farm animals, which did not judge her by her clothes or her silence. Her father beat her, regularly. According to multiple biographical accounts, he beat all three of his daughters. But Lorena, defiant, unwilling to back down, received the worst of it. She would not yield to him. That stubbornness, which cost her so much as a child, would later become the thing that got her out. When Lorena was 13 years old, her mother died of a stroke. Her father remarried. The new wife had no interest in Lorena. And so, at 14 years old, Lorena Hickok was effectively expelled from the family home with almost nothing. No plan, no money, no address to go to. She worked as a hired girl, a maid. Over the following 2 years, she lived with 9 different families, cooking and cleaning and caring for other people's children, moving whenever the arrangement fell apart. She was 15, 16, making her way through a world that had given her no reason to believe it would be kind to her. What saved her, if saved is the right word, was a distant relative named Ella Ellis, who agreed to take her in. Under Ella's roof, Lorena finished high school. She excelled. Her grades were near perfect. She had a gift for language, clear, direct, unadorned, that her teachers recognized even if the world had not yet. She enrolled briefly at Lawrence College in Wisconsin, then at the University of Minnesota. College did not take. She was too old, too impatient, too aware of how much the real world already owed her. In 1913, she walked into the offices of the Battle Creek Evening News and asked for a job. They gave her one. $7 a week, covering train arrivals and writing social items. Within months, she was asking for harder stories. She moved to Milwaukee, then Minneapolis, then New York. Each city was a rung on a ladder she was climbing, with no net beneath her. At the Minneapolis Tribune, she covered football and politics and crime, at a time when women in American newsrooms were almost universally confined to the women's pages, the social columns, the gentle human interest pieces no one read twice. Lorena wrote hard news. She fought for the bylines. She got them. By 1928, she had joined the Associated Press, the most powerful newswire in the country. Her editors, men who had resisted her at first, came to trust her judgment completely. She was assigned the Lindbergh kidnapping. She covered financial scandals. She wrote about power the way people who have never had it often write best, with the clear, cold eye of the outsider. She was 38 years old. She had built something no one had given her. A career, a reputation, a name that editors recognized. The girl who had been thrown out of her home with nothing had become, in a very real sense, the most powerful female reporter in America. She was, by any measure, exactly where she had always been trying to get. And then she was assigned to cover the wife of a presidential candidate, a woman named Eleanor Roosevelt, and the direction of everything changed. Lorena did not want the assignment. She had spent 2 decades fighting her way off the women's pages. Being sent to cover a politician's wife felt like a demotion, a return to the soft, low-visibility work she had always refused. Candidates' wives were decoration. They smiled. They waved. They said nothing worth printing. She told her editor as much. He sent her anyway. The first time Lorena Hickok sat down with Eleanor Roosevelt, sometime during FDR's 1932 presidential campaign, she wrote back to her editor a note that has since become something of a legend in accounts of their relationship. 4 words. She's a person. It does not sound like much. In context, it was everything. After years of covering public wives who had been trained to efface themselves, Lorena had encountered a woman who was actually there, present, thoughtful, unguarded in ways that women married to powerful men rarely allowed themselves to be in public. Eleanor talked about things that mattered. She had opinions she didn't apologize for. She was funny in a dry and self-deprecating way that Lorena recognized from the inside. By the time FDR won the election in November of 1932, the 2 women were seeing each other nearly every day. By the time FDR was inaugurated on March 4, 1933, the relationship had become, by any reasonable reading of the evidence, something more than professional friendship. On the morning of the inauguration, Eleanor wore on her finger a sapphire and diamond ring that Lorena had given her. That same day, Lorena conducted the first interview ever given by a First Lady on Inauguration Day. In a White House bathroom, the two women laughing at the absurdity of it, Eleanor still in her coat. The letters between them had begun by late 1932, sometimes 2 a day. They wrote with an openness that both women seemed to understand was extraordinary. Eleanor wrote that she thought of Hick when she fell asleep. Lorena wrote that she tried to remember the exact contours of Eleanor's face, the eyes, the corner of the mouth, and was disturbed to find the image fading when they were apart. The nature of what passed between them has been debated by historians for decades. Many biographers, including Blanche Wiesen Cook and, most recently, Sarah Miller in her 2025 biography, Hick, conclude that the relationship had genuine romantic dimensions, rooted in an unusually deep emotional intimacy. Others read the same letters more cautiously, noting that the effusive language of women's correspondence in that era does not always translate cleanly into modern frameworks. What is not in dispute is the intensity, the constancy, the way each woman appeared to structure her inner life around the other. What is also not in dispute is the cost, specifically, the cost to Lorena. By the spring of 1933, it had become apparent to everyone at the AP, and to Lorena herself, that her closeness to the First Lady made continued objective reporting impossible. She had become too involved. She had started sending drafts to FDR's campaign advisors for approval. Her loyalty was no longer to the story. In June of 1933, Lorena Hickok resigned from the Associated Press. She was, at the moment of her resignation, at the absolute top of her profession. She walked away from it. The question, the one that would follow her for the rest of her life, was what, exactly, she was walking toward. What came next was, on the surface, a new job. Harry Hopkins, administrator of FDR's Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA, needed a chief investigator. Someone to travel the country and report back on the actual human cost of the Great Depression. Not statistics, not policy summaries, but the texture of the thing. What it looked like in a mining town in West Virginia, on a farm in the Dakotas, in the breadlines of Detroit. Hopkins wanted someone who could talk to people and tell him the truth. Eleanor recommended Lorena. Hopkins hired her. And so Lorena Hickok traded the most prestigious press credential in the country for a government investigator's badge and a room at the White House. That room deserves a moment. It was on the second floor, just steps from Eleanor's own bedroom. A small space, a daybed, a writing desk, a lamp. By the time Lorena was settled, there was also a photograph of Eleanor on the desk, the one she wrote about kissing goodnight when the real thing was not available. For the next several years, this was where Lorena Hickok lived when she was not traveling. She moved through the executive residence of the American presidency the way a family member might, joining the Roosevelts for Sunday dinners, sitting in on conversations, present at the edges of history being made in rooms she had no official standing in. She was not staff. She was not family. She was not, in any category the world of 1933 would have recognized, the First Lady's partner. She was, as the press sometimes called her, the first friend. The work itself was formidable. Between 1933 and 1936, Lorena traveled 32 states as FERA's chief investigator, sending detailed reports to Hopkins and to FDR that helped shape New Deal policy. She visited coal towns where men had been out of work for 2 years. She walked through relief offices in California, sat in on family court hearings in Mississippi, interviewed farmers who had watched their land turn to dust. Her reports, raw, specific, unsparing, were read directly by the President of the United States. In a very real sense, Lorena Hickok's eyes became Roosevelt's eyes in parts of the country neither of them could reach. And through all of it, she wrote to Eleanor. Every day, or nearly every day. From dusty motor courts in the Southwest, from borrowed offices in the industrial Midwest, from whatever lonely room she happened to be sleeping in that week. Eleanor wrote back, "I miss you greatly, dear. The nicest time of the day is when I write to you." The intimacy deepened, and the complication deepened with it. Eleanor was growing. The shy, self-doubting woman who had told Lorena in 1932 that she was terrified of public speaking was becoming, with Lorena's encouragement, one of the most visible and articulate public voices in America. It was Lorena who first suggested she hold press conferences, and, crucially, that she allow only women reporters, thereby guaranteeing that the major papers would have to start sending female correspondents to cover the White House. It was Lorena who encouraged her to start writing, first a monthly column, then the daily column My Day, which would eventually be syndicated in 135 newspapers. Eleanor was learning to speak, and the woman who had taught her was watching from a government car in rural Tennessee, reading about it in the papers. By the mid-1930s, something had begun to shift. It was not a single event. It was a gradual recession, the way a tide goes out, so slowly that you don't notice the waterline moving until you realize you're standing somewhere different from where you started. Eleanor was becoming famous in her own right, not as FDR's wife, as Eleanor Roosevelt. The column, the press conferences, the advocacy for civil rights, for women in the workforce, for the unemployed and the dispossessed. The public had begun to see in her something they hadn't expected in a first lady, a person of independent moral weight. Lorena's diabetes, diagnosed years earlier, had begun to worsen. By 1936, the illness had progressed to the point where sustained travel was no longer manageable. She resigned from FARA. She took a lower visibility position, promoting the 1939 New York World's Fair. Respectable work, but a long way from the front page of the AP. Then, from 1940 to 1945, she served as executive secretary of the Women's Division of the Democratic National Committee, living primarily at the White House for much of this period. She was still there, in other words, still in the building, still within reach. But the quality of the closeness had changed. Eleanor's life had grown larger. Her circle of correspondents, colleagues, and causes had expanded in every direction. Lorena, who had always been intense, demanding, sometimes stormily so, found herself increasingly on the outside of rooms she used to move through freely. The letters continued, but they were different now, more careful on Eleanor's side, more anguished sometimes on Lorena's. "Hick, darling," Eleanor had written in an earlier year, "I believe it gets harder to let you go each time, but that is because you grow closer." By the early 1940s, that particular tone, urgent, nakedly affectionate, had cooled into something warmer but more measured. A deep loyalty, a real care, but not the same thing it had been. By 1945, Lorena's health had deteriorated so significantly that she was forced to leave the DNC. She was 52 years old, partially blind, financially fragile. Eleanor helped find her a position with the New York State Democratic Committee. Then, as even that became impossible, Eleanor helped stabilize her finances more directly, sending money, sending clothes, sending her chauffeur when Lorena needed moving. It was kindness, genuine, sustained, undeniable kindness. It was also a particular kind of grief to be on the receiving end of. To go from the person Eleanor could not sleep without writing to the person Eleanor sent money and second-hand coats to. In 1954, a frail and nearly blind Lorena Hickok moved to Hyde Park, New York, to be near Eleanor. She settled in a small rental cottage a short distance from Valkill, Eleanor's home on the Roosevelt estate. She was not inside the house. She was close enough to visit regularly. She spent her remaining years writing biographies for young readers, a memoir of Eleanor called Reluctant First Lady, a book she and Eleanor co-authored about women in politics. She wrote in a room that looked out toward the trees of a property she would never own, dictating to a typewriter she could barely see. Eleanor was just down the road. On November 7, 1962, Eleanor Roosevelt died at the age of 78 at her home in New York City. The news reached Lorena Hickok in Hyde Park. She was 69 years old, largely blind, barely mobile. By accounts preserved in the historical record, she was too ill to attend the funeral, which drew world leaders and dignitaries to Hyde Park's St. James's Church. The President of the United States was there, the former president, ambassadors, Adlai Stevenson. That evening, according to accounts that have been preserved, a local minister drove Lorena to the edge of the cemetery, close to the burial site. It was near midnight. She could not walk far. She carried wildflowers, the only kind of goodbye available to her, in the dark, alone, as the dignitaries slept. She laid them on the ground and stayed for a long time. In the years that followed, Lorena worked quietly on something she had been contemplating for a long time. She had in her possession thousands of letters. Her own letters to Eleanor, recovered over decades, retrieved from wherever Eleanor had kept them. And Eleanor's letters to her, the ones that had survived, the ones she hadn't burned. Because she had burned some of them, many of them. According to historian Roger Streitmatter, whose 1998 book Empty Without You compiled and annotated 300 of the surviving letters, Lorena had begun returning to retrieve the letters she had written to Eleanor as early as 1936. Over the following decades, she systematically destroyed the most intimate of Eleanor's letters to her, dropping them, Streitmatter writes, one by one into the flames of a fireplace. In 1966, she explained herself in a letter to Anna Roosevelt, Eleanor's daughter. "Your mother," she wrote, "wasn't always so very discreet in her letters to me." She did not want Eleanor's reputation damaged. The era she and Eleanor had lived in, the era they had loved each other in, was not ready for the truth of what had passed between them. And so she burned the evidence, protecting Eleanor in death as she had protected her in life. But here is the thing about Lorena Hickok that changes the entire story. She did not burn all of it. She kept the rest. Thousands of letters. And she stipulated in her will that the letters be donated to the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library, and that they be sealed until 10 years after her own death. She could have destroyed everything. She had 30 years after Eleanor died. She chose not to. It was a calculation, a deliberate act of preservation dressed as discretion. She was giving the letters to the future, to a time she could not see, a world she was gambling might be more capable of understanding than the one she had lived in. She was saying, in the only language available to her, I was here. We were real. And someday, someone will know. She died on May 1st, 1968. In the years after her death, the friends and colleagues who might have come to claim her were gone or scattered. Her sister was a nurse with her own life and little involvement in Lorena's. There was no partner, no children. The woman who had once dined with presidents, traveled with the First Lady, shaped the New Deal from the inside, died in a rented room with no one to take her home. Her ashes sat unclaimed on a shelf at a funeral home in Rhinebeck, New York. For 20 years. In 1978, a researcher named Doris Faber went to the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library to work on a biography. She opened the 18 boxes that Lorena Hickok had donated, sealed, as instructed, for a decade after Lorena's death. Inside, more than 3,000 letters. The discovery was, in the word used by many who have written about it since, electrifying. Eleanor Roosevelt, the most admired woman in America, the moral conscience of a nation, the architect of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, had written letters that began, "Hick, my dearest," and ended with words she had sometimes switched into French so that no one standing nearby could hear them clearly. The world was not ready. Not entirely. Debate erupted immediately. Some historians accepting the letters as evidence of a genuine romantic love, others insisting on a more cautious reading. That argument has continued, in modified forms, ever since. In 2025, Sarah Miller published Hick, a biography drawing on all 3,500 surviving letters. Her conclusion, after reading every one of them, was measured and direct. They loved each other. It was a romance rooted in friendship. Whether it included physical intimacy is something, Miller notes, we cannot know for certain. What we can know is what the letters show. 30 years of letters, from a woman who kissed a photograph goodnight because the real thing was not there, to a woman who tried to hold the memory of a face and was frightened when it began to fade. Somewhere around 1988, the records are imprecise, Lorena's ashes were removed from the shelf at the Rhinebeck funeral home and interred in the cemetery, in an area set aside for unclaimed remains. No marker, no name. It was not until 1998 that a Hyde Park woman named Patsy Costello, who had known Lorena in her final years, had sold her the newspaper at the drugstore down the road, began asking questions, tracked down the funeral home, made the calls, found out what had happened to the ashes. She thought it was a shame. In the year 2000, more than 30 years after Lorena Hickok's death, a gravestone was installed at Rhinebeck Cemetery. It reads, AP reporter, author, activist, and friend of E.R. The word love is not on the stone, but someone, on the day the marker was placed, left wildflowers.